Looked at your pay stubs, you know just how much the feds take out of each check, each pay period.
Tonight, an investigative unit exclusive, a story we've been working on for months. You're about to see money, power, and political connections allowing millions of your hard-earned dollars to be spent in what some are calling a questionable manner. Here's Chief Investigator Chris Nakamoto with this special report, Misused Money.
3 years ago, the WBRZ investigative unit brought this contract conundrum to light, raising concerns about $47 million going to a company that employed the general of the Louisiana National Guard. Unknown at that time, the general and one of his associates received $1.6 million. All of that was hidden from the public until now. This is a story about influence, money, power, and politics. A tangled web of sorts, one that we've been working to unravel for months. In fact, let's step back a few years. Rewind to June of 2020.
I do believe and have made the decision that it is appropriate to transition into phase 2.
Our nation experiencing a pandemic the likes of which we hadn't seen in more than a century.
Everybody needs to take personal responsibility.
The stay-at-home order in Louisiana lifted just weeks earlier. The WBRZ investigative unit exposed this questionable contract awarded to a company, Dynamic Construction, that would set up a field hospital for COVID patients in the city of New Orleans at the convention center.
Something that could be potentially criminal.
At issue was a possible conflict of interest.
He's working for the entity that's supposed to be supervising the job, but he's also a supplier to the job.
As General Glenn Curtis, the Adjutant General of the National Guard, was hired as their Director of Operations. This is what a corruption watchdog told us then.
An impropriety doesn't necessarily mean a criminal offense. It may mean the good old boy network, a wink and a nod. And that's the image that Louisiana is trying to move away from.
Now, that good old boy network appears to have been much more entrenched than we first knew. The state maintained it did nothing wrong. In these emails saying General Curtis himself didn't get a contract from the state, though he was employed as Dynamic Construction's Director of Operations. But look at what newly obtained documents show as they were telling us that in May of 2020. 9 weeks earlier, on April 1st, a change order is submitted and approved, set to pay $1.1 million to Curtis's own company, JRC Development, LLC. That came just 5 days after the ink had dried on the initial contract, which paid Dynamic Construction with Curtis listed as their Director of Operations. 2 others would be named in that change order. One of them, General Curtis's associate, Colonel Jennifer Mummy, established a company called JC2 LLC 3 days before the state agreed to pay millions to set up the hospital at the convention center. Her company received $510,600. At the time, Mummy's company was only 7 days old. The other named, the father of Dynamic Construction's owner, Jimmy McCoy, receiving $3.9 million for his company, Iron Horse Construction, LLC.
We didn't know then what you've presented to me today. And even without knowing this, my comments some 3 years ago was that the entire process, I believe, was tainted by the fact that General Curtis had left the National Guard and immediately was a part of a construction team that got this lucrative contract.
Goyeneche calls all of this new information,
she got $510,600,
even more problematic.
This is, I think, a good old boy network on steroids. So this is even more concerning. I thought it was concerning 3 years ago. And now what I'm seeing, I think what needs to happen, there needs to be an audit conducted of this entire process.
6 days after the ink was barely dry on the contract, Governor John Bel Edwards issued a proclamation.
This was done on 4/1, and look at the date she started her company.
Suspending the state's ethics laws.
That's going to be the problem.
Though the laws were in place at the time the contract was signed,
She knew before the contract was signed that she was going to be given
Something was gonna happen.
submit a change order.
Goyeneche believes a clever workaround was exploited.
I believe either the Louisiana Inspector General's office or one of the federal Inspector General's offices that are responsible for overseeing the funds that were provided to the state of Louisiana from a federal agency for this hospital. But this, to me, requires a complete audit to determine what services were delivered for these funds that were the change order, the $14 million in change orders.
Goyeneche believes every dollar needs to be accounted for.
What does JC2 LLC do?
We have no idea.
With an explanation of the work that was performed.
She formed this company in recognition that she was going to be included in this deal.
As it's clear, those with close connections benefited from an emergency contract paid for with your money.
That's the type of thing that I think infuriates the public, and I think the public is owed an explanation, starting maybe from the governor, to explain whether he's reviewed this, was aware of these facts, and how he feels about what is now coming to light.
The WBRZ investigative unit reached out to General Curtis and Jennifer Mummy for an interview on the story, along with Dynamic Construction. We were unable to locate contact information for Jimmy McCoy, who was also mentioned in this report. Despite 1,000 beds being set up, demand never materialized at the COVID hospital. During the peak of our state's COVID surge, fewer than 200 people used it. For the investigative unit, I'm Chris Nakamoto.